Welcome to another deep dive with us. This time, we're going deep into the world of deception and self-deception.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So we're going to be exploring, the reasons why we evolved to lie.
Mhm.
And maybe even more interesting is why we lie to ourselves.
Yeah.
So for this deep dive, we're looking at a couple of sources. We've got a chapter from Robert Triver's book, The Folly of Fools, The Logic of Deceit and Self-Deceit in Human Life. And we're also looking at a lecture transcript from Robert Sapolsky on the neurobiology of aggression.
Right. Well, it's fascinating how both deception and self-deception are often seen as uniquely human traits.
Right.
But as we're going to see today, it's actually deeply rooted in our biology and even has some parallels in the animal world.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump right in. Both sources talk about, the evolutionary reasons for deception. So what's the advantage of being like a really good deceiver?
Well, deception can be a really powerful evolutionary strategy.
Mm-hmm.
When it's relatively rare, it can provide a significant advantage, whether, you're an animal trying to avoid a predator or a human trying to navigate complex social situations.
So like a little bit of lying can go a long way if nobody else is doing it.
Exactly.
Okay.
But as deception becomes more common, then, of course, it becomes less effective.
Right.
Think of it as this evolutionary arms race.
Okay.
So you have, on one hand, those who are being deceived.
Right.
They start to develop ways to detect deception. And this leads to, like, a constant back and forth
Yeah, that's super interesting.
between the deceivers and the detectors.
That makes me think of, like brood parasitism in birds.
Right.
The source material mentions cuckoos, right?
Yes.
How does that illustrate this arms race?
Cuckoos are really the masters of deception when it comes to raising their young.
Uh-huh.
They lay their eggs in other birds' nests.
Right.
And to increase the chances of their offspring surviving, they've evolved some pretty deceptive tactics.
Okay.
For example, cuckoo eggs can mimic the host bird's eggs in size and color, and even patterns.
Wow, that's crazy.
And if a cuckoo egg is rejected,
Uh-huh.
the cuckoo might even destroy the host's entire nest
What?
to ensure their deception works.
That's pretty intense.
It's a pretty cutthroat strategy for survival.
Yeah, definitely. But what about us? How does self-deception fit into all this?
Well, self-deception is tied to the idea of cognitive load.
Okay.
When we lie, it actually requires more mental effort than telling the truth.
Right.
We have to suppress our natural reactions,
Mm-hmm.
come up with plausible stories,
Uh-huh.
and constantly monitor our behavior so we don't get caught.
So it's like lying is like way more work than just telling the truth.
Exactly. Research suggests that lying does have this cognitive cost.
Okay.
It can manifest in subtle cues,
Mm-hmm.
like changes in our voice tone, or even physiological responses, like sweating or increased heart rate.
So it's not just about what we say, but it's also about how we say it.
Precisely. And this is where self-deception comes in.
Okay.
If we can convince ourselves of a lie, even partially,
Yeah.
then we're much less likely to show those telltale signs of deception.
So it's easier to convince other people if you've already convinced yourself.
Right. We create what you could call a false internal narrative
Oh.
that we then project to others, and that makes our lies more believable.
It's like we're method acting our own lies.
Right.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And it gets even more complicated when we consider the concept of what is called the divided self,
The divided self.
particularly within families.
Okay, so the divided self within families. Now that sounds interesting. What does that actually mean?
Well, evolutionarily speaking, parents and children have conflicting interests when it comes to resources.
Okay.
Parents, driven by, the desire to ensure the survival of as many offspring as possible,
Right.
they aim to distribute resources equally.
Mm-hmm.
Children, on the other hand, are wired to seek as many resources for themselves as they can get.
Right.
You see,
So it's like a biological tug of war between like parents wanting to be fair and children wanting more for themselves.
exactly.
That makes sense.
And this can actually lead to subtle forms of manipulation and deception on both sides.
Oh, wow.
A child might exaggerate their hurt feelings
Mm-hmm.
to get more attention from their parents.
Yeah.
Or a parent might subtly manipulate a child with a reward to get them to do their chores.
Right.
Triggers argues that these small deceptions,
Uh-huh.
they're rooted in our evolutionary history.
It's amazing how these like primal instincts play out in, even like our family relationships.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if anyone's ever truly being completely honest, right?
That's right.
But, we're talking about how we're wired for self-deception. Is that always like a bad thing?
Well, that's a great question.
Or can it ever be beneficial?
Self-deception isn't always negative. For
Uh-huh.
instance, there are studies showing that writing about traumatic experiences can improve immune function.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's as if confronting these difficult emotions
Mhm.
and creating a narrative around them, even if it involves a degree of self-deception, can lead to tangible health benefits.
So reframing our experiences, even if it involves, maybe like a little bit of self-deception, it can actually be good for us.
Think about the placebo effect.
Right.
If you convince yourself that a treatment will work,
Yeah.
your body can sometimes respond as if it's, actual medicine.
That's wild.
It shows just how powerfully our minds can influence our physical reality, even if we're unknowingly deceiving ourselves.
It's like the power of belief, right?
Exactly.
But, I imagine self-deception can also have, negative consequences.
Absolutely.
So when does it become detrimental?
If we're constantly distorting reality
Mm-hmm.
to fit our desired narrative,
Right.
it can lead to poor decision-making.
Okay.
And it can hinder personal growth.
Gotcha.
For example, if we constantly tell ourselves we're doing great when we're actually failing,
Right.
we'll never address the underlying issues that are causing those failures.
So it's all about finding a balance
Exactly.
and being self-aware of when we're deceiving ourselves.
Right.
One thing that stuck out to me was the concept of the euphemism Fredmill
Oh, right.
the source material brings up.
Yeah.
It's this idea that we constantly come up with new terms to disguise unpleasant realities.
It's a very subtle
Right.
but pervasive form of both deception and self-deception.
Right. Like we might think we're being, more sensitive by using these new terms, but often we're just avoiding the truth.
Exactly.
It makes you realize how much of our language is actually just loaded with these like hidden meanings and manipulations.
Right.
Another example that I thought was really interesting was the name letter effect.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, the name letter effect is this phenomenon
Okay.
where people tend to have this unconscious preference for letters that appear in their own names.
Okay.
You get this, it can even influence major life decisions,
Really?
like where they choose to live or even what career path they pursue.
That's so interesting.
It's fascinating.
We're subconsciously drawn to things that remind us of ourselves.
Right.
Even if it's just like at the letter level.
Exactly.
What does that tell us about self-deception then?
Well, it points to how our self-esteem and early childhood experiences can shape our unconscious biases
Right.
and tendencies towards self-deception.
Okay.
We may unknowingly gravitate towards things that validate our sense of self, even if it's not necessarily in our best interest.
So we're all kind of walking around with these like hidden biases and preferences
Yes.
that are shaping our choices without us even realizing it.
Exactly.
That's kind of a little unsettling, isn't it?
It is a little bit, yeah.
But so if we're all so prone to self-deception,
Yeah.
what can we actually do about it?
That's a great question, and it's a question that we're going to explore further.
Okay.
But cultivating self-awareness
Uh-huh.
and critical thinking are really essential first steps.
Gotcha.
It's about questioning our own assumptions and biases.
Right.
And seeking out diverse perspectives
Okay.
that can challenge our own views.
It sounds like a lot of work, but
It is.
I guess it's necessary if we want to break free from the folly of fools, like Trivers says.
Right, yeah.
Are there any practical strategies that we can use to actually combat self-deception in our daily lives?
Well, one important step is to cultivate honest relationships with friends and advisors
Okay.
who can provide objective perspectives.
Right.
It's about having people in your life who are willing to,
Yeah.
call you out when you're being delusional or self-deceiving.
Yeah, to have those trusted people that can, give you some tough love sometimes.
Exactly.
That's so valuable.
It is.
So we need to be more mindful, more critical of our own thoughts,
Right.
and surround ourselves with people who can keep us honest.
That's right.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation so far.
Yeah, me too.
I'm eager to dive in even more.
There's so much more to uncover.
So stay tuned, listeners, because in part 2 of this deep dive, we're
Yep.
going to be getting even deeper into the fascinating world of deception and self-deception. We'll be back right after this short break.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to our deep dive on deception and self-deception. Before the break, we were talking about how language can be used to sort of disguise unpleasant realities. We're always coming up with new euphemisms for things that we'd rather not talk about directly.
Right.
It reminds me of something that Trivers talks about in his book, this idea of the danger of fantasy.
Yeah, that's an interesting connection.
Yeah.
Fantasy can be a form of self-deception.
Okay.
When we indulge in fantasies about a situation, especially like a risky one or, even an illegal one, we might actually be setting ourselves up for failure.
Okay, so how does fantasizing about something make us less prepared to deal with it in real life?
Let's say, for example, you're fantasizing about committing a crime.
Okay.
You might focus on the thrill of getting away with it,
Right.
the potential rewards,
Uh-huh.
but you completely ignore the very real possibility of getting caught
Yeah.
and facing the consequences.
Right. So it's like we're creating this perfect scenario in our minds
Exactly.
where everything goes smoothly and we don't really prepare for like when things go wrong.
Exactly. And this lack of mental preparation can backfire when you're faced with the actual situation.
Oh, okay.
So if you haven't really considered the possibility of things going wrong,
Mm,
your anxiety might skyrocket,
right.
making you more likely to make mistakes and ultimately less effective at deception.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like the more we fantasize without thinking about like the negative consequences, the more those consequences are going to like really blindside us in reality.
Right.
Which brings up another question. How do we recognize deception in others?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Are there any telltale signs that we should be looking out for?
That's a question that has intrigued people for centuries.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's no foolproof method for detecting deception.
Right.
Human behavior is so complex,
Yeah.
and people can be deceptive for various reasons.
So there's no magic lie detecting trick.
Not quite.
Okay.
But while there's no single giveaway,
Right.
there are certain cues and patterns that we can look for
Okay.
that might raise red flags.
Gotcha.
So, for example, inconsistencies in a person's story can be a sign.
Uh-huh.
If their account of events changes over time,
Right.
or if their words don't really match their body language.
Right. Like if someone says they're not nervous, but they're like fidgeting and avoiding eye contact.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We can also pay attention to their emotional responses.
Okay.
Are they showing excessive emotions or inappropriate emotions
Oh,
for the
this is
situation?
interesting.
It could be an attempt to mask their true feelings
Right.
or manipulate your perception.
So, like, if someone's laughing hysterically when they're being accused of something serious,
Sure.
that might be a sign that they're trying to, like, deflect suspicion.
It's possible, yeah.
Okay.
But it's really crucial to remember that these are just potential cues.
Yeah.
They're not foolproof guarantees of deception.
Right.
People can be nervous or fidget or behave strangely for reasons that are totally unrelated to lying.
Okay.
Context is key.
So it sounds like detecting deception is more about observing, like, patterns and inconsistencies rather than looking for one specific tell.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's like piecing together a puzzle.
Right.
You need to consider all the available information before you can make a judgment.
Okay.
It's also important to avoid jumping to conclusions based on a single observation.
That's good advice.
Yeah.
So we've talked about, the evolutionary roots of deception, the dangers of self-deception, even some tips for like spotting lies in other people.
Right.
But how does all this play out in like the real world?
Yeah.
Triggers looks at some pretty intense examples of deception on a larger scale, right?
It does. Yeah.
Like in geopolitics and stuff.
Yeah, he examines several historical and contemporary events
Mm-hmm.
through the lens of deception and self-deception.
Okay.
One compelling example is the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
Right. That's a major, world event with like huge lasting consequences.
Absolutely.
So how does this concept of self-deception help us understand what happened there?
Well, the lead up to the Iraq War was full of claims about weapons of mass destruction
Right.
and links to terrorism that later turned out to be false.
Right.
And Schreidlers argues that the Bush administration engaged in a form of collective self-deception.
Okay.
They were so convinced of the threat posed by Saddam Hussein
Uh-huh.
that they basically ignored or downplayed evidence that contradicted their narrative.
So they created like this false internal narrative, but on a national scale,
Exactly.
leading to like this disastrous decision.
Yeah, they selectively sought out information that supported their pre-existing beliefs,
Uh-huh.
and they dismissed any dissenting voices. It's a really powerful example of how self-deception, particularly on this collective level,
Yeah.
can have devastating consequences.
Yeah. It's a really sobering thought.
It is.
And it makes you wonder how many other like major decisions throughout history have been like shaped by these kinds of self-deception.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah,
Trivers also looks at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right?
it does.
Highlighting how both sides have engaged in like forms of self-deception to justify their actions and demonize the other.
Yeah,
That's a very complex and sensitive issue with a long history.
it is.
So what kind of insights does Trivers offer there?
Well, he delves into the historical narratives
Okay.
and the political rhetoric surrounding the conflict,
Mm-hmm.
showing how both sides have at times engaged in
Right.
selective memory, historical revisionism,
Okay.
and the suppression of inconvenient truths to bolster their own positions.
So like this classic example of us versus them thinking.
Exactly.
Where each side is constructing a narrative that makes them look like,
Right.
the victim, and the other side look like the aggressor.
Exactly. And this type of like group-based self-deception
Yeah,
can make it incredibly difficult to find common ground
right.
or reach a peaceful resolution.
Yeah, these examples, they paint a pretty bleak picture.
They do.
It makes you realize how deeply ingrained deception and self-deception are, like in human nature.
Yeah.
Even on this like global scale.
It's a complex and challenging reality.
Yeah.
But I think understanding these mechanisms is really crucial
Okay.
if we want to create a more honest and just world,
Right.
both in our personal lives and on a larger scale.
So we've tackled some pretty weighty issues today.
We have.
But what about, the everyday implications of self-deception? How does this all relate to like our personal lives?
That's an important question, and that's actually what we'll explore further when we return.
Welcome back to our deep dive into deception and self-deception. We've been talking about some pretty complex ideas, from evolutionary strategies to global conflicts, but how does this all relate to our everyday lives?
Well, self-deception can actually play a big role even in, those seemingly mundane interactions.
Okay.
Like, think about how often we rationalize our bad behavior.
Oh, yeah.
We make excuses for being late,
Right.
or not finishing a task,
Uh-huh.
or snapping at someone we care about.
Oh, yeah, I'm definitely guilty of that.
Right.
It's so much easier to blame external circumstances than to just own up to our mistakes.
That's a classic example of self-deception in action.
Right.
We're basically protecting our ego by creating a narrative that absolves us of blame,
Uh-huh.
even if it means twisting the truth a little bit.
So we're telling ourselves a story that makes us feel better, even if it's not totally accurate.
Right.
But what's the harm in that?
Well, it might seem harmless on the surface, but over time,
Okay.
this kind of self-deception can really prevent us from learning from our mistakes
Right.
and growing as individuals.
Okay.
We're always making excuses.
Yeah.
We're never going to address those underlying issues
Right.
that are causing these problems.
So if we're not being honest with ourselves about our, shortcomings,
Mhm.
we can't really work on improving them.
Exactly.
Okay, so then how do we actually break free from these patterns of self-deception?
One powerful strategy is to cultivate a practice of self-reflection.
Okay.
So take some time each day
Uh-huh.
to really examine your thoughts and your actions. Honestly,
Right.
ask yourself some tough questions.
Like what?
Like, am I being truthful with myself?
Okay.
Are my actions aligned with my values?
Right.
What are my true motivations behind this behavior?
It sounds like that takes a lot of courage and honesty.
It does.
It's not always easy to face those uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
It's not easy, but it's essential for personal growth.
Right.
It's about shining a light on those dark corners of our minds where we might be hiding from the truth.
Okay.
And remember, you don't have to do this alone.
Right. Sometimes we need someone else to help us see things more clearly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Another helpful strategy is to seek feedback
Okay.
from trusted friends or advisors.
Right.
Ask them for their honest opinions about your behavior
Mm-hmm.
and be open to their perspectives,
Okay.
even if it's not what you want to hear.
It's like having a mirror held up to you, reflecting back a side of yourself that you might not be able to see on your own.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's important to choose people who are both honest and compassionate.
Okay.
You want someone who will tell you the truth,
Right.
but also support you in your growth.
So it's like this balance between accountability and empathy.
Exactly.
Okay.
And finally, we can all practice mindfulness and meditation
Okay.
to become more aware of our thoughts and emotions in the present moment.
Right.
These practices can help us observe our internal narratives without judgment
Okay.
and develop a greater sense of self-awareness.
It sounds like mindfulness can help us create some space
Yeah.
between our thoughts and our reactions.
Exactly.
And that can help us see things more clearly and objectively.
By becoming more mindful,
Yeah.
we can start to recognize those patterns of self-deception as they arise,
Right.
and then make more conscious choices
Okay.
that are aligned with our values.
So the key is to be self-aware, seek out honest feedback,
Right.
and practice mindfulness.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
It is. It's a journey, not a destination.
Well, listeners, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into deception and self-deception.
We have.
From the evolutionary logic of deception to its impact on, global events and even our everyday lives.
Right.
It's clear that deception and self-deception are really deeply intertwined with, the human experience.
Absolutely.
We've learned about the dangers of fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
the subtle ways that we rationalize our bad behavior,
Yeah,
the importance of self-awareness,
right.
and seeking honest feedback.
It's been quite a journey.
Yeah, it has.
It has.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with one final thought-provoking question.
Okay.
If we are indeed wired for both deception and self-deception,
Yeah.
how does this affect our ability to trust our own perceptions and judgments?
That's a question each of us has to grapple with on our own.
It's a tough one,
It is.
but it's definitely one worth pondering
Absolutely.
as we continue to navigate this complex and often deceptive world.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.